Hi, this is David Gornoski, host of A Neighbor's Choice and Things Hidden podcast, as well as some of our other programs like Science and You with our chief science advisor, Dr. Yu, and our seed oil survival series that we continue to have great fun unpacking the truth of nutrition. I wanted to give you a quick little message saying we appreciate all the support that we get from our uh, monthly contributors and our one-time donation supporters. And we'd encourage all of you to go to our website, a neighborschoice.com, click on contribute, and make a monthly pledge today, whether it's $1, $5, 15, 20, 50, whatever you want to do. Doesn't matter. Just be a part of building this new media project that we've developed to empower and inform, to inspire, to kickstart a scientific renaissance, an anthropological breakthrough and reformation in the church. All these things are possible with your support right now. So make that commitment today and help us keep doing the productions that we have. Thank you. Today we have a special guest with us. We have someone who is one of my favorite anarcho-communists. He's a guy that's been, he used to debate the late legendary Jerry Hughes about why Jerry should not cling so tightly to the U.S. Constitution and embrace an anarcho-communist philosophy. We have with us from the communist headquarters with all their newspapers behind him, Jim Babka. How you doing, sir?
I'm here with the workers, holding up, fighting the proletariat.
Now, how many newspapers you guys shipping out? Looks like you got a big warehouse full of communist manifestos. What do you got going on?
Yeah, so my backdrop is just a warehouse setting, just to make my room look bigger than it is. I'm actually in a very tiny room right now.
Oh, come on. That's like a very humble communist thing to say. You've got a great industrial process going on. Everybody is paid the same amount of money for your publishing outfit, and you're
This
doing
is exactly right, and we're all happy about it too. In fact, we would like to give half the money back.
Yeah, there you go. Just to make it fair.
Just to make it fair.
We have Jim Babka, noted anarcho-communist philosopher, with us, and also your podcast. What's it called? Grace.
It's called Gracearchy. Gracearchy with Jim Babka.
Gracearchy.
Yes, and it's available on almost all the platforms and apps you can imagine, especially YouTube.
And that comes out of your belief in Christian mutualism and anarcho-communism as the early church practiced it?
Okay. So it comes out of my belief that I believe that the world that we've been given runs best when there is grace. And I believe if you're going to choose a social or political system to do that, you would have the most voluntary system possible. So that means that people, we should not be violating the consent of other human beings. And when we do, we necessarily damage their happiness, social harmony, and even prosperity.
So when you see the early church practice their mutual aid, what do you think of that? Is that something that should be the basis of Christian economics and gracearchy, as you call it, rule of grace?
No, all kidding aside, people make arrangements all the time, whether it's with family or friends or communities or civic clubs or churches.
Or co-ops.
And I think that co-ops, yeah. In fact, we homeschooled our kids, and that was the co-op was a tremendous resource for us. So to the degree that it's possible for people to voluntarily associate, provide for each other's welfare, look out for each other's needs, that to me is a wonderful thing. What should be the case, though, is that anybody that doesn't want to stay in the commune could leave the commune. If you don't like the rules, you could leave, right? Any community that you belong to, any relationship that you have, you should have free will to be involved and participate in it. Being a voluntarist, which is my actual personal social philosophy, means that I believe that every relationship that I'm in is one that I have chosen. And so it wasn't handed to me and I wasn't required to stay in it. and that I can freely exit. And we have various words for this. We have divorce, secession. We have a whole bunch of other concepts out there. It might be that it's a little bit messy to separate from a given relationship that you have, particularly one that's contractual or where there's been, resources joined together. But you should be able to choose all of those relationships with every one of your, with everyone, and that includes your government. You should be able to choose who your regulators are, who your insurance providers are, who provides your welfare, like all of that, all the things that you believe that you need, you should be able to choose for yourself. You should, and that is on the basis that I think it's an empirical fact. You have more power as a consumer than you do as a citizen. So the idea would be that, just like we can not go to a certain business and we go to another one instead, or we can complain and they'll come and adjust our order or give us a free meal or whatever the deal is. We have that same ability with everything, and that includes how we're regulated, how we're governed, how security is provided.
Now, one of the things that I've been trying to do is try to help integrate some of the ideas of mimetic theory and some of the implications of that on the human person into political philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never called myself a libertarian, and I've never been a libertarian, and I've never, wanted to kind of make an apology for that philosophy. But I do have a lot of common agreement on a lot of things that some libertarians say. And
mm-hmm.
I am a political atheist, and I think that's very similar to voluntarist, as you call it.
Yeah, no, I not only agree with that kind of that labeling there, but I wouldn't be doing Gracearchy with Jim Babka if it weren't for Rene Girard. Like the mimetic theory helped me discover empathy, and empathy helped open my eyes to all the ways that grace is being manifested in the relationship we're supposed to have with the Word of God, that is Jesus Christ.
I've just recently interviewed Gil Bailey, who's one of the great contemporaries of Rene Girard. Mm-hmm. He did more of the theological side of things in the vein of a theologian named Raymond Schwager, and he just put out a new book called The Apocalypse of the Sovereign Self, in which he goes in and he shows how Christianity birthed the concept of the person, right? And then the individual was this concept that kind of came out like a there's different ways to put it, but basically the idea is that the individual self is an inferior concept to the idea of Christian personhood, and that the individual self is an ideological construct that comes out of the environment that Christianity creates, in which Christianity starts to protect the one, right? The misfit, the scapegoat, the other from the community, expelling them. So that dislodges the universal tribal identity that all human beings basically were locked into various degrees prior to this Christian revelation with Christ's passion coming into history. So it dislodges this kind of lack of recognition of a person, but that individualism and individual rights and all these other things that come out later on are kind of like an inferior misrecognition of the Christian person that actually is where we need to go, and that our society, so basically, in other words, individual rights and the concept of self is an upgrade to some degree to the pagan sacred, in which we are units of a tribal sense of self. So it's an upgrade, but it's an inferior place to stay because it's a myth itself. The idea that you are an individual who's sovereign of your own desires is a misrecognition of the mimetic nature of your sense of self, and the obligation you have to become aware of that in order to actually truly be, in some sense, free. You have to be free from the delusion of the romantic lie of the self. So that's one of the things that libertarian types and classical liberals and conservatives sometimes have a problem with mimetic theory when it comes to deconstructing the self enough. They like mimetic theory when it comes to hitting the scapegoat mechanism, because that's more of like an easy hit, to kind of like, the state is kind of sacred and kind of culty and violent, and scapegoat mechanism sounds about like statism, so we can kind of get on board with that. But then when you start deconstructing the individual self, it opens up confusion, pushback, and I don't know about that. So I just wanted to see. That's why I wanted to explore with you the idea of the individual versus the person here, and as it means for people who love liberty and people who love grace, as you mentioned, and Christian anthropology.
So Rene Girard helps me discover a Christian, a Jesus-based, if you will, anthropology. I think that part of what is wrong with the evangelicalism with which I was raised, a big significant problem with it is that Jesus was God. And even though there is this belief, even though that's a factual statement, it's also the case that Jesus is man. And in the sermons and the teachings and the way people thought about Jesus, repeatedly you keep coming across this phenomenon where it's almost like he had God cheat codes. He might have been a man, but he had God cheat codes. He wasn't really a man. He wasn't really like us. There's a great scene in Blazing Saddles where the men are all sitting around a campfire and one of them, they're eating beans, right? And one of them farts and then another one does. And they keep doing this all the way around. And it's a very comical scene. But I could easily imagine Jesus hanging out with his disciples. They're eating whatever the tack they're eating as they're traveling about, and having moments like that, real human moments. And so having an anthropology of Jesus is incredibly important. I noted in what you said there that you also talked about the underdog, and I'm unique in this. I haven't heard anybody else express this, but I've been at this libertarian thing now for 27 years, and I think that libertarians have an direct empathy for the underdog. What they tend to do is look at a given social situation or problem, and their eyes or their ears are directed at the person that's being overlooked. And they're pointing out that person's rights are being violated, generally is the language that they're using. The third thing I want to say about what you just said is that I think the state isn't a little culty, it is a giant cult. And I think it includes blood sacrifice. And I think it's as pagan an institution as we could possibly imagine or still have present amongst us. And it's responsible for a great deal of evil. I know that you've had Richard Koenigsberg on your show, and he is not exactly Girardian, but there's an overlay there. You can see some rhyming between their approaches. And he repeatedly quotes Carolyn Marvin, who wrote Blood Sacrifice in the Nation. She argued that there always was a totem and that we actually sacrificed our own people to that totem. So Koenigsberg is at great pains to say that the real purpose for our wars, you take a war like World War I, or you take Hitler's statements and the Nazi leader's statements about World War II, and you keep seeing this recurring theme where sacrifice was considered a noble thing. And that manages to make its way into our system, because when it was recently here as the Colin Kaepernick situation, there was a great deal of anger about the fact that he would kneel during a symbolic ritual, which was a flag. And then why? Well, because men died for that flag. They sacrificed. So I think that there is a great deal of these are the areas with which I know I agree with you. Now, lastly, I'm not sure I understand the distinction you're making. I heard what all you said, but I don't understand the difference between a person and an individual. To me, they're the same thing. Well, person's a more personable way to speak of an individual.
Right. But it's not just, I'm not just saying like word thinking, like don't use the word individual, but there's a philosophy behind the concept of a sovereign individual versus a person who's made in the Trinity, the way the Trinity is, right? The Trinity has three persons, right? And they exist as one God, right? And this is where we get the concept of personhood, as Gil Bailey points out in his book, and others have pointed out, is where we get the idea of personhood to begin with. It comes from Christian theologians and deriving this notion that personhood is interdividually shaped. It's the same thing that Rene Girard talks about. I'm just saying that one of the first things that I did when I started understanding mimetic theory was originally A Neighbor's Choice was meant to be like, I was going to create like a study guide curricula and develop it for like churches to have small groups to understand a Christian approach to the state and law and justice and culture making, like the whole thing. And so I had to rethink, and I was looking at, and one of the first kind of like rudimentary approaches that I started looking at in terms of like how is this different from, say, a classical liberal or libertarian philosophy? There may be some of the similar policy overlap ideas, but the orientation of the why we're doing this is different. Like in a libertarian kind of individualist a framing of things, it's about, my sovereign right, me, to do what I need to do as long as I don't aggress against you, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whereas when you kind of take a more personhood approach to it, you're looking not so much of what is my sovereign right to do, but rather the question becomes, what is my obligation to my neighbor made in the image of God, who has the same dignity of personhood that I have? So that orientation on the surface seems like a small quibble, but it actually creates a whole new cultural environment when you orient not just your philosophy, but the language and the whole in community spirit is saturated with love of the neighbor as the orientation, rather than my sovereign rights to not be aggressed upon. And people may think that's a little tiny quibble, but it actually it actually creates a world of difference. As some say, one small little theological differentiation can create a whole world of problems. In this case, it's kind of an anthropological differentiation that I'm talking about. And what I'm suggesting here, I don't really want to get stuck on trying to defend libertarianism or not, but rather, what does a society look like if it learns to orient around the concept of personhood to get its liberty and its justice and its order, rather than me individualism as kind of like our antidote to all the problems? Because I think that's where the problem of our culture has drifted into, is that individualism has been uprooted from its Lockean type framework, and it's been wedded to more Rousseauian type ideas and positive rights and all these other things. But functionally, it doesn't really seem that different to the average person to go from an individualism that is Lockean, that's saying I have a right to my life, liberty, and property. So that's a negative concept of freedom, right? To not be aggressed against, versus a positive concept of freedom, which is like, I have a right to health care. I have a right to, food. I have a right to a home. I have a right to your labor. That's where we get this Rousseauian and Marxist stuff later on. But it's all basically under this, what Rene Girard calls the romantic lie of the self, which is this idea that my desires come from my own heart and that it's an expression of my individuality to pursue those desires. And so I guess Christianity kind of, if we let it saturate our anthropology, might start to kind of winnow that error down at the very core, and perhaps allow us, in my opinion, to build a liberty that's more sustainable and more Christ oriented.
Okay.
Just throwing out some ideas to think through.
There's a lot there. There's an awful lot to grab onto there. I think that I am a tiny bit of an outlier, although less and less so as I have conversations with people, because I find that other libertarians and even people who are libertarian adjacent find some of these ideas attractive. I don't believe "Don't tread on me" should be the central message of libertarianism. I believe that it would be much better if that central message is "Don't tread on others." And I would be even more heartened to find that people would recognize that every time they tread on others, there are negative side effects, that other people's happiness and harmony and prosperity goes down. That's a condition that's just, it's like gravity. It's just going to keep happening. So don't do it. So my journey into Girard starts with watching Ron Paul in a televised debate while he's in his second presidential campaign in front of I believe it was South Carolina crowd. And it was that crowd, it was made up of a lot of people that I suspect was in church the previous Sunday morning or the one to follow. And he invoked a golden rule in foreign policy. And when he said golden rule, you knew that he pricked their conscience, because the audience began really aggressively booing him. And I was kind of appalled. I don't know if I'm shocked, but I was definitely appalled. It set me back. And that set me on a journey that a few months later led providentially to finding Rene Girard's work. And I became very, very interested in the subject of empathy. We've now gone through, after years later, we've gone through a situation where we as a country kind of really frayed at the edges extremely bad during the C word. I won't say it. I don't want you to get censored or blotted out. But we had this national thing where we were all putting on stuff over our face and hiding our face and pretending that worked. And then we were getting a big shot and pretending that had some kind of, that was going to make us safer. And people really went at each other's throats. And I came to realize that it wasn't enough in that situation to simply say, don't tread on others. Gracearchy is inspired very much by the idea that I believe that forgiveness is really good. Tolerance is really good, forgiveness is even better. But what we're called upon to do and what's really needed socially is this ability to reach out to people who are very, very different from us. So this summer I had the opportunity to meet Daryl Davis, who is famous for meeting with Klansmen and white supremacists and so forth. He is a black keyboard player that played with Chuck Berry, does blues and rock and roll.
He was like my second interview on my podcast, or first or second.
Yeah, and he's got 26, I think, Klans robes hanging in his closet, right? I mean, because he's invested the time to meet with these people and have conversations with them. And that's kind of a role model for me. An even bigger role model, obviously, anthropologically speaking, would be Jesus himself, who said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do, long before they could have possibly known what they were doing, because they weren't aware. They didn't have that consciousness of what it was that they were doing, of the epic crime that they were committing. And so that brings me to a point where I believe that if we can't get to a point where we are at least able to, where we have a desire built into us to want to understand people who are different from us, as opposed to scapegoating them or using violence against them or coercing them to just be exactly who we want by any means necessary, the situation will continue to spiral worse and worse and worse, because the way the mimetic rivalry works is they become more and more like each other. They forget more and more about what the original dispute is, and they become more and more focused on destroying the other. And that's the path that it appears to me that we're on of late. Everything has become politicized, everything, and it has arrived in the pews as well. And I believe that something more. I just want to be clear from where I'm coming from. I don't believe it's sufficient. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient to say that don't tread on me. I don't think it's that's going to cut it.
That's good. Yeah, you're right. We're at a state of undifferentiated rivalry for everything. Gender wars, it's cutthroat gender wars. It's cutthroat Russia versus America, Western versus the East, with the BRICS, everything's starting to get, it seems like more of the cutthroatness is from the Western side, though. It seems like a lot of the other guys are showing a lot more restraint than us. Unfortunately, it's kind of embarrassing. But it just shows you how anti-Christian the mindset is of the people that run DC. But we see the whole world is infused with, like you said, undifferentiated rivalry, to the point where you don't even know why you're fighting. Like half those people that like of the Democrats that loved in the neocons that love to hate Russia, they don't even know why. It's just they've been told so many times, hate them, hate them, hate them, hate them. They're just like, we gotta hate them, we gotta hate them. And it's like, how do you live with such like blatantly like inflated conceptions of hatred? Like, you have no basis for that. I mean, the only thing they had was that dumb 2016 psyop about Russia hacked the election to stop Jeffrey Epstein's best friend Hillary Clinton from renting the White House. But they don't really have much. I mean, I guess they have movies. They did have the Cold War. I mean, so it depends on the age group, I guess, that people still have a lot of just.
No, I tend to think that there's a mass media propaganda that's spewed out by a war machine that's very, very profitable. And so let's pick an older example that's easier for people to digest, and they can blame their parents and grandparents for being the bad guys instead of themselves, right? Maybe it'll be easier for them to take it. In the late 1970s, students, as they were called, reactionaries or whatever, took over the U.S. embassy in Tehran. And they captured embassy personnel, over 50 of them, and held them hostage for over a year. And they were released on Inauguration Day when Ronald Reagan took office. So this was the end. This was the entire ending of Jimmy Carter's presidency. And why did that happen? At the time, everybody's like, "Oh, this is horrible. We should bomb them back to the Stone Age. We should turn the whole place to glass." There was even a popular song that was on the radio, "Bomb, Bomb, Bomb Iran," sung to the tune of "Barbara Ann" by the Beach Boys. So this was everybody's mentality. But what people didn't know, Iranians knew this very, very well, but Americans didn't know that their government had toppled a democratically elected government in 1953, the government of Mossadegh, and they recognized the installation of the Shah, who led a brutal regime to follow a very secular regime, which they resented. He kind of forced his secularism down their throats, and they reacted, and that's why the Ayatollah Khomeini became such a hero. He was sending in reel-to-reel tapes, and they were being duplicated and circulated. People get together in groups, despite the fact that it was illegal to listen to him and consume his information. And they began to find out their true history and what the U.S. role had been out of that very same embassy, which had been the base of the coup that had overthrown the government. The situation right now, the reason people are upset with Russia is very, very clear. Russia invaded, Putin invaded. But did people know what happened in the decades leading up, starting with the fall of the Soviet Union? Do people know the history of what happened that led up to that moment? And the truth is that they don't. And so, because they're so led around by the nose, or they were just born yesterday in so many ways, they don't know history. They're easy prey for this. So, to me, if I want to live a life of grace, one of the things I think I have a need to know is, like, when two sides are fighting, what are their motives? What really led them to this place? And I don't want to straw man these ideas. I want to steel man them, right? I don't want to make them easy to tear down or burn up arguments. I want to know what their very best arguments are for the behavior they're engaged in. Yes, Putin invaded. This is a horrible thing. But would it help us to know? Would we all be better off if we understood why he did what he did? And even if you still disagree at the end of the day, even if you think he's a hateful jerk face, still just taking the time. Grace is taking the time to kind of try to understand even your enemy.
Do you ever think, do you, when all the activities that you do you believe that, one day it may be possible that, like, the vast majority of Americans will just have the same love of liberty to the degree that someone like you does? Do you really think that's possible? Like, you're just striving and striving, and then one day, they'll have that kind, the majority of the population will kind of have a sophisticated, empathic view of every boogeyman that we're supposed to hate around the world, and we'll have a very sophisticated, empathic view of. Do you believe that will happen on a political level there? I mean, and like,
well, first off, I believe that I'm here in this time and place. This is where God put me. Yeah. And I believe that I have a duty to do the work that I feel led to do, and to do the best I can with it, and then leave the results in the hands of God. And I hope, as I've gotten older, better and better at the leaving the results part. I've less and less, as time's gone by and my vision has gotten longer and longer towards eternity, thought that worrying about the timeline of this whole thing is actually a negative. And when you stop doing that, you start to realize that some of the short-term ideas that you have, maybe because some of the political quick fixes, won't solve the problem, that the problem is much deeper, and it will require doing certain things that don't seem to be as effective at the get-go. And I can't help observing that, you've been out in this field now. I think you and I talked about what you were going to do with mimetic theory and political reform. I don't know. I think it's 2016, maybe, that we talked about this face to face. But you've been doing articles, you've been doing the show, you've been faithful in conveying these ideas. And I know that you know this. There's people now all over the place that are talking about this. There's been new books that have come out. There's conferences going on. There's more and more people that are beginning to discuss these ideas all the time. And so does seem to be some kind of awakening. I would tie to that very same notion that I'm noticing that more and more people recently, and people I would not have the least bit expectation this would have happened with, have begun having a real interest in faith. I'll tell you a personal and a public story as anecdotal examples. A personal friend of mine that I've known for, again, 26, 27 years since I got involved in the libertarian movement. There's no way I could have imagined him having any interest in faith. But he would really like to find a church. He would really like to find a place now. And he talks about how this is the thing that's missing in the country, is that there isn't a strong basis of faith. And I don't even know, David, that he's actually a Christian yet. But he senses something's wrong, and he senses that's where the answer lies. And I have other conversations that are like this one, but this one happens to be my most dramatic example. The other is that Oliver Anthony was recently on the Joe Rogan show and read scripture aloud. And Joe Rogan was pleading with him to do it. Now, Joe Rogan, if you would have been on that show in 2018 or 19, would have mocked or ridiculed. He did openly mock and ridicule belief in religious faith. But the people that he found out, that the people who were like the so-called experts, he found out what he was personally victimized by them in the whole ivermectin scandal, the whole horse paste crap that they did. And he has over time had an awakening that something's wrong. And he's begun to realize that there's some salt of the earth people out there, and they're listening to his show. And I don't know if there's an openness there, if he's suddenly maybe interested in faith, but the kinds of discussions that he's been having with some of his guests of late, it's been more than one, have been really, really interesting. But in that Oliver Anthony interview, he asked this new country artist 3 times if scripture was involved in what he was doing. Could he read the scripture? He used the word scripture, which is not a word that skeptics tend to use when they're disparaging it. And to me, something is happening out there. But even if it wasn't, I feel like my duty is to keep doing the work.
Yeah, I agree with you in large part. I think that what I'm trying to do is try to get people to, have an intellectual conversion that ends up kind of percolating and creating new, excitement from people who are tastemakers and hopefully sense makers, and people who kind of like the early adopters of our society, kind of push things forward. But I don't believe that the majority or the masses will ever like have some kind of elaborate philosophy about things, but they'll go with where the tastemakers go, right? And the way in which I think that all of this is going to play out is that, and again, it's one of the running themes of my work that I've developed, is that you have to, the renaissance for liberty and the appetite for a culture of family and order and liberty and that kind of thing and peace is contingent upon the types of technological developments that are brought to the public. So, and this borrows from different folks, but you could look at Marshall McLuhan and others. But the idea is, for example, a very simple one that I point to a lot is the one that James Dale Davison makes in the Sovereign Individual book that he wrote, where he talks about this idea of like the logic of violence being related to the technology that people have, so that, by the time the Revolutionary War happens, it's because it's available and it's allowed to happen because of the musket, right? The musket becomes something that everybody has access to, and it changes the dynamic between the human person and the ordinary reality and the sovereign, the state. And he said, this changes the possibility for liberty and citizens to say, I have rights here, sir, and we will enforce them, because there's a technology that has balanced a little bit at that time the individual peasant or farmer in relationship to the king and his aristocrats. Mm-hmm. And to jump forward to today, I think that we're in an artificial stagnation because of our mimetic blind spots to hold up dogmas of science and physics and energy and health and nutrition and all these things. And that Christians,
and partisanship.
Yeah. And Christians who have an anthropological, like if you kind of see behind the veil, which I'm trying to help people see, to see the sausage making of human desire and human bodies of knowledge, even, right? And how we kind of create these sacred auras around quantum physics and relativity, just the same way that the Pharisees created sacred auras around their religiosity that Jesus had to poke holes in. If we learn to imitate Jesus, we will be able to unleash things that will make Nikola Tesla look like small potatoes. And we can do that. And when we do that, like when we change, for example, the big elephant in the room is energy. If we could have decentralized energy that's too cheap to meter and unable to be metered by powers, and that goes for your home and your car and everything else in between. That's a game changer. That's a musket times 1,000.
Yeah, no, that definitely is.
And it's like, to me, that's the big thing that Christian, anthropology should help kind of open up. We don't all have to be engineers, but if engineers guided by the kind of toolkit of mimetic anthropology and suspicion of groupthink, if that starts to saturate, man, that's the game changer, because that's when we get to tell these people take a hike. And if the people who love Jesus and love liberty are the ones who bring these ideas to the public will follow. Well, what was it that made you see that? Was it your atheism? No, we're not atheists. We're Christian. Oh, so imitating Jesus allowed you to create energy too cheap to meter? I want to learn more about what that is, and that's what, to me, in my opinion, that's what Christians are called to do,
I agree with that. I think that there is a healing our world role for us here, right? It is fallen, it is broken. To overstate it, the ushering in of the eschaton is in part bringing. We are the body of Christ. We're supposed to be bringing that healing and that love to the world. I think, playing into what you just said, I believe, number one, that our conflict is very costly. The amount of time and energy that we spend in vengeance is costly to us personally. It damages our relationships, and it goes on to damage the communities that we're in. And so how do you create these environments of trust? Because I think, how do you make sure that the people who are in that community of trust are matched to their talents and their capacities instead of just trying to earn a buck? So a lot of my thought these days has to do with management, how enterprises work and get things done. To me, if you can't get voluntarism going inside a business enterprise, then how can you sell it out in the world? So I've been thinking a lot about those issues. I do think there are two technologies that are new and on the horizon, so to speak. One's not going to sound new to anybody anymore because they feel like they've heard it before, but it's Bitcoin. I think that's a tremendously revolutionary technology that has huge upside capacity, and it takes time for things to adopt and for all of the things that are needed to support it make it real. But this ability to transfer now microtransactions through the Lightning Network is a quantum leap for that entire technology. And then that's being married to something called Nostr, which a lot of people recognize as kind of an ugly, Wild West kind of Twitter. But Nostr is actually relays. Instead of sending all your stuff up to a big server in the sky, and then that server decides whether or not you can or cannot disseminate your information. They can choose to block you or censor you. You set up a system with multiple relays, where if one system cuts you off, there's still 19 others that want to deliver your message to the recipient who says they want to receive it. And this allows you to get behind the highest techno-authoritarian state on the planet, right? There are Chinese people that are able to access this because the state can't censor them in the same way that it does everything else. The way that we've all experienced, frankly, not to the degree that the Chinese do, not even close, but the stuff that we've experienced on Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and so on. So there's a game changer. That Jack Dorsey's out pounding this as much as he can. He's on Nostr every day, posting messages. But this opens up the opportunity, not just for a little messaging system. It really opens up the opportunity for people to begin communicating in entirely new ways, developing new technologies for e-commerce, for internet, websites and everything. The whole internet could be completely remade on this technology, frankly, but it's still It's in its infancy. It's incredibly primitive at the moment. And I was just yesterday morning listening to a podcast called "Thank God for Noster." I'm new to the podcast. I was only just got finished with the first episode, but here's believers coming out and saying, "Hey, look, we were at a Bitcoin conference. We've learned about this. We want to figure out ways to uh, to use it for godly purposes." So it's not just using these technologies, as you're pointing out, for godly purposes. It's actually creating these technologies, and I see them coming, and I see the opportunity in all of this stuff. I see and more.
Yeah, and it's so that's a social media technology or something, or
yes, Nostr, Noster.
And but these technologies are what McLuhan calls extensions of man. They kind of like change the human anthropology itself. The environment of our relationship changes,
Mm-hmm.
and understanding it's not just the content of these devices or social media or whatever, it's the technology itself, which is altering what it means to be human for good or bad. And if Christians would put more effort into boldly teaching their flocks to be engineers and physicists who dare to do things that are considered to be scientifically impossible or heretical, anti-gravity, elemental transmutation at room temperature, these are things I talk about a lot, just to kind of highlight some big benchmark revolutionary things that standard model of physics says can't happen. And then you get heterodox scientists that say, actually, we're tinkering around and we're saying we can do that. I think Christians should stand on the side of the marginalized when it comes to science, just as much as we stand on the side of the marginalized when it comes to society,
Yeah, definitely. And I a couple of years back, during the summer vacation of a summer break of a school, I did some volunteer work where I was helping painting some classrooms. Which, by the way, is really laborious because it got these concrete block walls that just suck up the paint, right? So and the room doesn't seem that big until you start painting one of them. And I was in there painting all day, and so I started looking for podcasts, and I started looking for like, hey, where's David been? I'm gonna go look for him, and I found you here, there, and so forth. And I noticed a recurring theme in these podcasts that you were doing in the late teens, 2020, 2021 timeframe. And that was, you were also talking about the need for art. We should be leaders in art. This is where we get back
I
to
thought
kind
you were
of
about to say, I found the more I inhaled the paint, the more your podcast made sense.
It wasn't that much kind of paint. It wasn't enough fun. But you were talking about, art moves the heart. Art touches people in ways that they don't even necessarily realize they've gotten a new idea sometimes, but they're moved by it and they want to do something about it. And you talked about this kind of openly, like we should be writing the songs, we should be making the movies, and how frequently, unfortunately, so-called Christian art sucks, right? It's just not really good. And we're not, maybe devoting enough attention to it. I think you're onto something. And this all speaks to an anthropology of like living a life that has some meaning. We just got through interviewing theologian Baxter Kruger on our show. And he tells this story of being out on a speaking tour, and he's picked up by this young man who just graduated from seminary. And it's farm country. They're driving down the road. And this young man, he's asking him what he's going to do with his career. And he said, well, I think I'm going to become a pastor of a church. And he's like, okay. And he says, they're driving by and there's a guy in a John Deere, piece of equipment out in the farm field. And he says, what's your message to this guy? And he says, I don't know what you mean. He's like, well, how does the gospel relate to what his farming? What is he doing right now? And this pastor had no answer. He didn't know how to answer that question, right? Like, I don't know, you get up and you do expository preaching from the scripture or whatever it is that everybody does. But at the end of the day, he didn't really have a message for what that man does, and we tend not to think of that as full-time Christian service. But where would we be? Like when you sit down to eat and you say grace, you thank God for your food. Do you thank God for the farmer that got it there too? I mean, like people made it possible for that food to get there. Their work is sacred, and in participating in that work, they're participating in the creation. They're making sure that all this is happening. They're stewards. They're fruitful in what they're doing, and we need those people to do what they're doing. We need the farmers, and so all these people are people we need. And I would, so I guess the call here overall is to, there is a Christian mission in doing the work that you do. It is full-time Christian service in which you're engaged, whether you are working on the dock, or you're working at a fast food restaurant, or you're farming, or whatever it is that you're doing. If you're acting or composing, there's Christian service there. If you're figuring out the new realms of science and technology, there's Christian service there.
And I like that. And I want to push this into more controversial territory, which would be, for some folks, is that like Christians should not be shy to, especially the ones who believe you believe in free markets, right, Jim? I mean, you like the word
100%.
So
I do.
But there's a lot of Christian culture around free markets that justifies doing stupid, bad, ugly things in the market. So, for example, my friend Joel Saladin talks about how he has to be careful when, he does regenerative agriculture, polyculture, rotational grazing, and, back to nature, understanding of the grass and that kind of thing for chicken and cows and pigs and so forth. But, he can get into trouble when he goes to a small town church and preaches against Monsanto and factory farming, because somebody's got somebody that works there, a deacon, or somebody works for one of those giant companies, or their nephew does. And I want to be balanced here. I don't want to have this haughty attitude of like, no, we condemn all that. It's evil. But at the same time, Christians should be able to have a conversation about that, grounded in what it means to be Christian thoroughly, not like a Christian side interest, but like thoroughly a part of incarnational Christianity, which is how we treat animals, if we're going to be farmers, matters. How we treat the land matters. It may be lawful for you to have a free market enterprise that does factory farming, but is it ethical from a Christian standpoint to continue to do so? Or is it more Christian for you to, if you are geared towards that, try to do what you can to skew that machine back towards the natural, healthy, ethical way of treating animals? That's just one example, a farmer. But there's a lot of examples like that. You could whoever, all those horrible Christian films, right, that people have made over the years, they had pastors, and somebody could have been in that church and said, hey, I saw early, a cut of some of the stuff you're doing. I love your approach, but is there any way we can make this less preachy and ham-fisted? Can we put a little subtlety to this? Can we make it a little bit more like the art we find in the Bible? And it's like, can we have that conversation, or does it have to be this kind of desperate appeal to, no, it's his business, it's a market, he's making a movie, I don't, it's in good taste if it says the name Jesus in it. It's like, no, that's a very simpleton view. And that's why the culture is the way it is because we don't put every part of it under the framework of imitation of Christ, right? And we don't think, for example, that Christ has any interest in like aesthetics. What is that? That's something liberals do. That's the general mindset of somebody who likes free markets. Aesthetics. Okay, that's what, no, that's what Jesus does, right? I mean, Jesus is the author of aesthetics, the beauty that we see.
Oh, and he spoke in parables all the time, right? Like, yeah. He could have given lectures. He could have pulled out, and said, this is point one. I've got a 3-point sermon for you today. The homiletics that are taught now are very Greek. They're not very Hebrew. They're not part of what Jesus would have known or understood or used to get his points across. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those homiletics necessarily. I don't want to go that far, but I you're right. There's art to that. Like, telling a really powerful story is artful. Personally speaking, I had to walk away from something because I recognized that I wasn't being Christ-like in it. And so I was, I got my start in libertarianism because I was a disgruntled Republican in 1996 and saw Harry Brown on television, decided that's who I needed to vote for. And 4 years later, I was working for him. So along the way, I meet, a lot of prominent libertarians. And the year 2000 was a very interesting year for me, being press secretary on his campaign. After the campaign was over, just like political parties are prone to do, we had to pay the price for having done the work. No good deed goes unpunished in a political party. It's a collective. We got to punish the people for their failure and impugn them, because we, of course, could have done better. Even though we didn't have a plan, we could have done better. And so one thing leads to another. And in 2003, my membership renewal is sitting on the table. And I get a call from a friend who worked at the national office. His name was George. And George had found out that I, in a fit of anger about something that George had been involved in, I had said bad things about George, which is what you do in politics, just a giant gossip pool, and you're snipping at each other's backs all the time. And I liked George. And I realized all of a sudden it just dawned on me, David, that, geez, who have I become? And I said, you just helped me figure something out, George. I'm not going to renew my membership. And he's like, no, that's not what I meant. It's not what I meant. He still wanted me to stay in the club, right? And I was like, no, I don't like who I've become as a part of this process. Fast forward to 2009 or 10 timeframe. I found out that there was a guy, because I'd been chair of the Libertarian Party of Ohio in the late 90s. There was a guy named Steve who lived in Ohio, who was still carrying around bitterness and anger about how I conducted my chairmanship. And it had gotten back to me, the things that he'd written and said about me to various people. So, he was on Facebook. So I reached out to him. And I said, first off, probably everything you're saying about me is true, because we were trying to get things done. And I was, it was either lead follower or get run over by the bus. And so, probably true. And two, I'm sorry. Well, he follows me on Facebook to this day. Like, Facebook's a ghetto now. It's completely broken down. Hardly anything happens there anymore. Like, I put something up and it's like, you could hear the crickets chirping and see the tumbleweed go across the screen. And he is probably the person who, one of the people, probably one of the top 20 people to react to my posts to this day, because I said I was sorry. But that being in that political atmosphere, I thought it was life and death existential important that the work that I was doing. And I got out of that work because I realized what it was doing to me and my character. It wasn't allowing me to be Christ-like, frankly.
That's beautiful stuff. And you're leaning in with your message of forgiveness there. I like that. Let me ask you along that line, going back, you said getting out of politics, but if you could, like, just stay at the state level, is there like a dream law it's either written already? I know you guys have written laws at your organization, but
Yeah.
tell me your personal dream law if you could just fiat have it enforced at the state level in Ohio, where you're at, that you think,
in Ohio,
I got one shot to pass a bill, and it's like my one little David Stone against Goliath to like unravel multiple factors that lead to the morass that we're in today.
I don't know how to do this. Most of my focus through most of my career has been on federal issues.
I have one I want to suggest to you, but I want to
go ahead.
Go
ahead.
Yours first. Oh, okay.
Well, because I would go to the ones that I've already done, the Read the Bills Act, the Write the Laws Act, the One Subject at a Time Act. The Read the Bills and One Subject are kind of very complementary to each other in terms of, like, they each pick up a piece of the load.
But that's the federal level.
It is a federal level.
Well, let me suggest one. I think we should do what Ron Paul used to talk about, which is privatized marriage. I think that's the best thing, one of the best things you could do for the culture to heal the situation we're in.
I'm for that. I've been for that for a very long time. The two that I'm gravitating towards are ending the war on drugs, refusing to enforce it, that's the one I'm gonna pick, because there are a lot of police interactions that are caused by this. This is a civil asset forfeiture mechanism.
Ohio, would it be like an Ohio bill that says, in the state of Ohio, we are not going to enforce any kind of punitive action against individuals who are adults who
I wouldn't let them pull anybody over for it. I wouldn't let them search for it. I wouldn't let them arrest for it. I wouldn't let them confiscate property for it in a civil asset forfeiture kind of way.
Now, would you do that? Let me ask you this. This is a trickier question, but would you do that knowing that everybody else still has their relative drug laws all around the state of Ohio, so that one of the side effects of that law was that maybe a lot of drug dealers would start pouring into Ohio as the base of operations?
Yes.
And then you think would that have some negative effects? Intended effects?
Yes, but I think the positive effects would far, far, far outweigh. So, I had a chance yesterday to sit with somebody we're going to be doing some work possibly with on another project that I'm on called Respect America. And that's a newer project I'm involved in. And this dude was an insurance lawyer, white, college educated, obviously, like thought, had very conservative views about cops and everything else, thought that if you keep your nose clean, you're not going to be in trouble. But he was arrested and framed by police. He was accused of something he didn't do. Fortunately, there was video to prove it. And he went and found that video. His case was so compelling that the officers that were involved in his arrest refused to testify against him when it finally came to trial. It took 3 years because the state's case was that bad, but the state tried to get him in so many other ways. And while he was in that prison, the night that he was arrested, or the weekend that he was arrested, because they held him, somebody hung themselves in front of him, and he developed post-traumatic stress. And so, he's still living with the burden of that. That happened about a dozen years ago, and he's still living with the trauma of that. It shook him up so bad that when a cop pulls behind him, he'll literally break down. I think it's important to look out for those people who have been harmed by this process. We want to just simply reduce the numbers of people who end up in jail or prison, have their families broken up, have these traumatic situations. I think all by itself that would happen. I also think if it happens, and we have seen this with marijuana in particular, that we've seen this also with concealed carry. Both of these are phenomena where a little bit of liberty led to more.
What do you think about some of the George Soros DAs letting off violent criminals, pedophiles, shoplifters? San Francisco, you can loot up to $900 something, and so everybody goes in there to have videos. What do you think of that? Is that Gracearchy?
No. But if someone has, let's say, engaged in theft, one thing I'm a big believer in, instead of prison sentences, is restorative justice. The idea that you make recompense to the people you owe, and there's this restorative process that can be put into place where there's an opportunity for accused and the offender to sit down and actually have a dialogue, begin to meet each other. And they found when this has been experimented with in various places and times, that it creates healing. In fact, it does more to heal the victim than virtually anything else. We think that, again, this is another Christian anthropological question. Do we get more satisfaction from vengeance? Does the justice or the sentence that's been imposed give us more satisfaction in light of the victimization situation? Or does it help us more to have learned about the life and the person who did it, and find out a little bit about, kind of how they got to the night where they, or day, or whatever that they did, whatever it was that they did to you? Does that which one is more healing to the human person, to the victim themselves? And it turns out that both victim and offender end up getting healed by these processes. And sometimes they even become acquaintances or friends. And so can we set up restorative justice models, right? That actually deal with what actually happened. I do not believe, David, that when you commit a crime, that you have a debt to society, that somehow or other there's this amorphous thing that we can choose, and then we can put fines on you, and we can make you run up big legal bills and all this other stuff that does nothing to restore the victim. The only thing the victim gets is the joy in seeing you suffer. Do
you agree with George Soros DAs that people who steal $900 should not even be arrested by the cops? Or do you think they should be arrested?
They should be arrested. They should be arrested.
But then in an ideal world, instead of sitting in jail for several months, you think they should have some kind of interaction where the victim says, like if it's Walgreens, the Walgreens says, I want you to do some community service hours or paint my classrooms or whatever.
Yeah. No, I think that would be much, much better. Like there should be some way for them to restore. So theft is a material crime.
Isn't that what happens a lot? They get community service instead of jail time?
Yeah, but it's not designed in a way to make the victim whole. We just assume their insurance company will handle that, right? If someone's drunk and hits your car and you end up a paraplegic as a result of it, and then we take the offender and we put them in prison, how did they help with your healing? How did they help deal with the situation that the sentence you're going to walk away from their crime? And I'm saying that they should actually be engaged and perhaps permanently, depending on the severity of the crime. The rest of their life they might need a life sentence, so to speak, of needing to help David Gornoski with the problems that they've caused for David.
How would that be determined based on like the severity of their actions? Like if they're armed robbery versus stealing a petty theft thing or something like that?
Well, let me just go bigger picture instead and say that the way I'm thinking of this is the same way you were thinking of physics and we were talking about art and everything else. We have medicine right now that is highly, highly advanced from where it was in the Stone Age. We have evidence all the way back in the Stone Age of bones being set. So there was some understanding that you could repair, you could splint, you reset it, splint it, and leave with some adequate rest, the bone would heal, right? But they didn't have, even as recently as like the Civil War, you would get an infection really easy, and that just meant they needed to start sawing off a limb, and they give you a little shot of something to drink, and you bit down hard on something, and then they started cutting. I can't imagine the horrific pain that goes with that. I can't even begin to conceive of it. We've come a long way, obviously. Our justice system is still very much stuck in the Stone Age, and I'm saying if we had a Christ-based anthropology, we would be trying to find ways to continue to carry that forward. And it's probably a little harsh to say Stone Age. I mean, we do have due process. There are some things that we have done that have improved things, but the improvements have not been recent. There haven't been many. There needs to be much more significant work done in this area.
That's very good. So, Jim, I really appreciate having you on. And what can people expect from Gracearchy, your podcast, some guests or topics, and anything else you'd like us to know about?
Well, we are going to talk a little bit about this idea of technology because I want to do some stuff on Nostr and Bitcoin at some point. We're going to talk more about, we've just finished up a significant number of our recent episodes have been theological. We've talked to a pastor and a theologian. The pastor's work specialized in building a church on recovery, people coming in from recovery. So we've had some very interesting theological conversations with them. So we're trying to bring that grace message forward. I'm going to do an episode. I keep threatening to do this, but we're going to do an episode on the scapegoat. We've already done a first episode on Gerard. It was one of my first 10 episodes. I haven't yet gotten to the next one that I want to do on the scapegoat. So we're going to do some of that. We're going to continue to try to find ways to apply grace to the news and keep reaching for a better solution. I have to say, the interesting thing, I think you'll find this interesting, David, is that this show has had an effect on me. I'm the one that's sitting behind the microphone and coming in doing the teaching, but you've heard the phrase to teach is to learn twice. And what's happening to me as I'm thinking about ways to find grace in situations or apply grace, I'm finding ways in which I'm coming up short or things I didn't see or understand before, and my consciousness is expanding as a result of it. So it's even if the listenership starts to dwindle, I hope I can continue to hang on because it's meant something to me.
Yeah, it looks like I can see a joy in your face just thinking about it. So it looks like you're having a good time with there.
I am having a good time. I have a full-time job doing working for 6 or 7 other clients during the day. So this is the thing that this is the thing I do that I enjoy the most.
Do you have any speaking engagements coming up that people would like to know about?
Not public, no.
Okay.
No.
I know you do tour a lot sometimes, so that's good to.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, I really appreciate your time. And again, best of luck with what you're doing with your podcast. And we'll continue to look forward to future conversations.
Thank you, David.
I'm David Gornoski. Again, you can email A Neighbor's Choice at hello@aneighborschoice.com. Godspeed.